an interrupted seance. June Knox-Moore recalls the strange and contradictory story of Mrs. Helen Duncan.
Helen Duncan, you are charged with conspiring to pretend to exercise a kind of conjuration, to wit, that spirits of deceased persons should appear to be present, and the said spirits were communicating with living persons then and there present, contrary to Section 4 of the Witchcraft Act 1735.
So began the trial of Helen Duncan, but this was no 18th century prosecution. The scene was the courtroom of the Old Bailey, the year 1944. Mrs. Duncan was a spiritualist who had a flourishing practice as a materialisation medium, that is, one said to be capable of producing the spirit of a dead person in physical form from a substance called ectoplasm, exuded from her body. The appearance and composition of this material was to become a central issue of the trial. When she was arrested and charged under the Witchcraft Act, the court was packed out from the very first day. In the papers, even news of the war was pushed aside by a succession of bizarre headlines.
Police trap at seance. Constable grabbed spirit.
Ghost invited to give evidence on witchcraft trial.
Jury may hear voice of spirit guide.
Helen Duncan was a middle-aged working-class Scotswoman who'd been suspected of fraudulence more than once in her career. But why should the half-forgotten Witchcraft Act, passed over 200 years ago, with its roots going back to the Middle Ages, now be dug up and applied to a modern medium, fraudulent or otherwise? And why, in the crisis of war, should the authorities concern themselves with an obscure series of seances being held in Portsmouth, remarkable though the medium's demonstrations were said to be? It was a thought that also struck the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. As soon as the trial proceedings closed, he issued a directive to the Home Secretary, framed in his usual forthright manner.
Let me have a report on why the Witchcraft Act of 1735 was used in a modern court of justice. What was the cost to the state? I observe that witnesses were brought from Portsmouth and maintained here in this crowded London for a fortnight, and the recorder kept busy with all this obsolete tomfoolery to the detriment of necessary work in the courts.
But the obsolete tomfoolery was not as foolish as it seemed. According to some, there were hidden motives behind the prosecution of Helen Duncan, motives connected with the all-important war effort, but this was only to be revealed at a later stage. It was a trial that was to become a cause célèbre in English legal history, and also in the history of the spiritualist movement. But how had Helen Duncan become part of this movement in the first place? Her background couldn't have been more down to earth. She was born into a poor family in Perthshire, Scotland, in 1898, and sent out to work in a jute factory after only the roughest of educations. But her psychic qualities, it seems, began to reveal themselves at an early age. Mrs. Duncan's daughter, Gina Brearley, herself a medium, told me how the young Helen was warned by her parents against using such powers.
When little things happened in her early days of foretelling different things, she was very quickly told that this she mustn't do, even to the fact when she spoke of seeing a young soldier who had passed on, her mother said that you will go to prison, they'll put you in jail as a witch.
Helen Duncan's biographer, Alan Crossley, is also a medium. In his researches for his book, he came to trace her powers back to school days. Although she was a poor scholar, she once produced a correct list of history dates on her slate, purely as a result of some kind of psychic concentration, much to the disbelief of her teacher. I asked Crossley if Helen Duncan had ever told him how she felt about being the possessor of such powers.
Mrs. Duncan really had very little understanding of her own mediumship, because she was never conscious of it. She was always completely out. She in fact, she said if she ever saw materialise, she'd run a mile, because she was frightened of ghosts or anything to do with that.
Those early years were times of great hardship. Helen Duncan's husband suffered from a heart disease, and she was often the breadwinner, taking in washing, working in the fields, anything to support the family. But in spite of his ill health, Henry Duncan was taking an increasing interest in the development of his wife's powers, as their daughter remembers.
My father, in all this time, never gave up the idea of trying to prove life after death. My father, though he was psychic, was more interested in the workings of the phenomena, more than working to the purpose of helping mankind.
At the start of the 1930s, Helen Duncan began to demonstrate regularly at spiritualist meetings up and down the country. With the support of the Spiritualist National Union, her practice went from strength to strength, and by now the techniques of her mediumship followed the traditional procedures. She sat behind a curtain, known as the cabinet, and at all her seances a spirit guide named Albert directed the comings and goings of the spirit visitors. Alan Crossley describes what would happen.
Well, the medium, apart from having to be present, plays very little part in the seance. Mrs. Duncan has nothing to do with it at all. She's completely in a deep trance, unconscious.
What do you know about Helen Duncan's guide, Albert?
He's over 6 foot tall, very well spoken, totally different to Mrs. Duncan, who is a broad Scotch, in fact so broad you can hardly understand a word she says. He speaks to the person in the audience. He says, I've got a gentleman here. He passed. He'll give details of the gentleman's passing, and it's your husband. Will you call him forward? And lo and behold, the curtains open, and out comes this gentleman. And of course there's an immediate greeting, response, reaction from the person in the room, seeing their loved one.
And the room would be in darkness?
Yes, in darkness except for a red light immediately above and in front of the curtains behind which Mrs. Duncan sat. Mrs. Duncan sits on a plain wooden chair against a blank wall, and all she wears is a black dress and a pair of shoes. Nothing else. She is stripped and examined before every seance.
Now, you saw many of those forms yourself.
Yes.
Well, how lifelike were they, in fact?
Well, so lifelike that some of them used to bang their chests and stamp their feet, and some would open the ectoplasmic robes to show their physical body, naked body. A spirit form, when it materializes, has to have this temporary clothing of ectoplasm which shimmers and gives off a luminosity of its own.
A leading figure in spiritualist circles who knew Helen Duncan well at this period is Maurice Barbanel, the editor of Psychic News and a minister of the Spiritualist Church. In the years leading up to the trial, the late 30s and early 40s, he attended her seances regularly and claims to have handled that mysterious substance, ectoplasm.
I must have had 20 to 25 materialisation seances under conditions which I regarded as completely fraud-proof.
You've actually been inside what's called the cabinet and
I
seen
have
her.
sat inside the cabinet with Mrs. Duncan and watched the ectoplasm pouring from her through her nose, through her mouth, from her solar plexus, and building up into the solid form of her guide, Albert. From my recollection, must have been about 6 feet, and I would say Mrs. Duncan was somewhere about 5'3", 5'4". He was very efficient at producing the ectoplasm and the materialization.
What about ectoplasm? Can you give us an analysis of that? I mean, there has been such a thing as a laboratory analysis.
Oh, yes, there is a laboratory analysis with its components. Well, ectoplasm is to materialization what protoplasm is to matter. It is the building material that is used, and it's highly malleable. I mean, it can be almost viscous and semi-liquid to begin with, and become rock solid so that you can bang on it without any effect whatsoever. It is whitish in colour, self-luminous, which is also an extraordinary thing, because it didn't reflect red light at all. One of the most extraordinary tests I devised to disprove the suggestion that she swallowed cheesecloth and then regurgitated it. Incidentally, we had x-rays taken by a doctor to prove she had a normal esophagus and therefore couldn't have swallowed the amount of cheesecloth that was necessary. A friend of mine, a medical woman, Dr. Margaret Vivian of Southbourne, said, We can soon settle that. Ask her to swallow methylene blue tablets, which will dye the whole contents of her stomach blue during the seance. And she agreed to do it, but the volume of ectoplasm that appeared was snowy white, dazzlingly white, and self-luminous as before. There was no trace of any blue whatsoever.
Maurice Barbanel clearly has no doubts about Helen Duncan's authenticity as a medium, but he did warn her about the dangers of making too many demands on her powers, which could deteriorate as a result. And indeed, as the news spread of her strange gifts, so did the allegations of fraud. Harry Price, then director of the National Laboratory of Psychical Research, had set himself up as a leading authority on mediumship, and it wasn't long before he made Helen Duncan the special target of his investigations. On May the 18th, 1931, he devised a special series of tests. Their findings, published later, were very different from Maurice Barbanel's.
It was our fourth seance with this woman. At the previous sittings, I had taken a number of flashlight photographs of the phenomena, and we proved that the spirits that Mrs. Duncan produced were composed of cheesecloth, pretty girls' heads cut from magazine covers, rubber gloves, and we even photographed a safety pin that fastened bits of a phenomenon together. The cheesecloth showed folds and dirt marks, the selvage edges, the warp and weft, torn and loose ends, rents in the material, etc. In addition to our very thorough medical examination of her person, including instrumental exploration of all the body orifices, the medium wore our own one-piece seance garment. But the cheesecloth ghosts continued to appear. We were forced to the conclusion that Mrs. Duncan swallowed the cheesecloth, gloves, etc., and regurgitated them when in the cabinet, where, of course, she was unseen by the sitters in the red light. So we decided to X-ray her immediately after the seance, and before she had time to dispose of the stuff. We knew that the X-ray would not reveal cheesecloth, but thought that a stray safety pin somewhere within her might appear on the radiograph.
But at the very first sight of the X-ray machinery, Mrs. Duncan rushed outside the laboratory in a fit of hysterics. Her husband followed her.
Outside, we found Mrs. Duncan clutching the railings and screaming at the top of her voice. A crowd soon collected. Her husband tried to pacify her. The medium, who weighed 17 stone, was, of course, still in her black sateen seance combinations. Finally, we got the medium into the house again, and we found that her seance garment was torn in several places. As we thought that the woman might have got rid of the cheesecloth during the chase, we asked her husband whether we could search him. He refused.
Harry Price's findings caused quite a stir at the time, although, ironically enough, his own reputation in the field of psychic research was not to remain untarnished in years to come. Then, in 1933, Helen Duncan was again in trouble. After a séance in Edinburgh, she was convicted of obtaining money under false pretences and sentenced to a small fine. But Mrs. Duncan was undeterred by such setbacks, and the war years were to make even greater demands on her services, with more and more bereaved families seeking consolation in spiritualism. Then, at the beginning of 1944, came an engagement which was to prove disastrous. Sponsored by a spiritualist couple named Ernest and Elizabeth Homer, she was booked to appear at a meeting to be held above Mr. Homer's chemist's shop in Portsmouth, a mundane enough premises, dignified by the title of the Master Temple Psychic Centre. The distinguished spiritualist supporter Lord Dowding, then Marshal of the RAF, had only recently visited this major naval port to speak on behalf of the cause, and strong public response was assured. For a week's mediumship there, Mrs. Duncan would be able to command a fee of over £100. She began these seances on January the 14th, 1944, and on a certain evening the following week, proceedings began in the usual way, with Helen Duncan, a massive figure, ruddy-faced and dark-haired, having been duly searched, slumped in her chair in a state of trance. On just such an evening as this, a tape recording was made by Alan Crossley of similar proceedings. Despite its amateur quality, it conveys well the tension of the atmosphere, with that curious mixture of the homely and the macabre.
Next person to come here, I want someone your side, girl, but further back, towards the corner there, to ask a young lady out that passed to our side today. Now, I have a feeling that she's had an operation of some kind.
Is there something wrong?
Will you try her on?
Come on, dear.
No, she doesn't move on your way.
No.
Yeah, I know a young lady.
Yes, do you know her name?
Young lady, it's the name of Kathleen.
Yes.
Yes. That's right. Will you call her out, please?
Well, come along, Kathleen.
Oh.
Have you any message for the charm?
Yes.
Have you?
But I'm all right.
You are? Oh, that's lovely, Kathleen. Absolutely. I didn't expect to see you, but it's just lovely. Is there anything else I can tell Billy?
That's all.
On January the 19th, though, it was to be a very different kind of seance. It had begun, as ever, with prayers and singing. South of the border was a favourite with the spirit guide, Albert. There appeared to be the usual kind of audience of about 30 people, among them a certain naval lieutenant, Stanley Worth, who'd attended some of Mrs. Duncan's previous meetings, and with him on this occasion a War Reserve policeman named Cross. Two figures, shrouded in white, appeared and disappeared without speaking in front of the cabinet. Just as a third shape emerged, there was a disturbance in the second row of the audience. Cross pushed over the chair in front of him and leapt towards the curtains, clutching at the white form that stood there. Was it cheesecloth? Was it ectoplasm? At the same moment, Lieutenant Worth flashed a torch. A whistle was blown, the signal for a party of police to enter the room with a warrant for the arrest of Mrs. Duncan. Mr. Arthur West, the man in charge of the police prosecution, still has a vivid recollection of the whole extraordinary train of events.
Point was, of course, we did not believe this ectoplasm was other than a fraudulent production. And his main duty then was to get hold of it. But you see, what he was doing, he was sitting in the chair immediately behind Mrs. Homer. And she was a biggish woman. And when he pushed her chair forward to grab the ectoplasm, so-called, he knocked her over. She went over flying. And, of course, that was impeded his action to grab it. All he could touch was the arm of Mrs. Duncan and get hold of what he said was cheesecloth afterwards, muslin, butter muslin, he called it.
Mr. West was Chief Constable of Portsmouth at the time. Now retired and in his 70s, he told me how complaints of fraud by the Naval Lieutenant Worth and others had put the prosecution case in motion. With their compliance, the police raid had been arranged to catch the medium red-handed in the act of trickery.
The next thing is that the lights went up, the police inspector was behind, and there was Mrs. Duncan standing in her underclothes. And there was no Albert, nobody at all, resembling an Albert or a man of any sort. It was just Mrs. Duncan in her underclothes. She'd pulled the sheet down. She tried to get it off. And Cross's evidence was that he'd grabbed her arm when the muslin was on, before she could get it off, you see. First thing she said, well, I'm ill. I want to see a doctor. And she did, of course, later. The next thing is that Cross, I think it was, asked Worth, he said, where's the cheesecloth gone? And after a pause, Mrs. Duncan said, gone? Of course it's gone. It had to go somewhere. Didn't it?
That was contested in the case, that she'd actually said that.
Oh, yeah, I know it was. And it was indeed, yeah. That was the truth. That was what happened.
Did you at that point think your prosecution case would succeed, as you'd lost your vital piece of evidence?
Yes. To be truthful, we thought that the evidence that Cross could give was vital. And I told the director at the time, I said, this is so concrete. It's the only real concrete piece of evidence that we had. And we must proceed on that. And he agreed. And he said, I think you must. Apart from that, apart from all the jiggery-pokery that went on prior to that, the talk that was going on, the interchange of conversation which the so-called Albert was conducting, of course, which was Mrs. Duncan.
You're convinced about that?
Oh, yes, we were quite convinced about it.
Why? How did you become so convinced?
Well, first and foremost, we looked at the cabinet, you see, thoroughly, and no one could have got in there without us knowing it. They could not get in because it's an arc-shaped auditorium. And it was so dimly lighted anyhow, because she complained about the light, and when it was reduced to just a glow of red light, it was very, very airy conditions and very airy circumstances, which anyone could get away with.
On the evidence of witnesses, it seems that two figures could be seen within the cubicle. Mm-hmm. That is, Mrs. Duncan and her guide, Albert. Yes. So how could that effect have been produced?
I think most of it was done by the lighting of the room to start with. And the other thing is that her shoes, she had very high-heeled shoes that she could easily use to look taller than Albert if she could indeed make it appear that there were two people there. It's not difficult to do, I gather.
But nothing was found.
Nothing at all. Oh, you take it from me. People always say, well, you didn't search the place, Harry. Believe me, it was combed inside and out in every conceivable corner. And no one was allowed to leave that building that night. But how they got rid of it, I don't know.
Do you think she herself was responsible, or do you think her supporters were?
We thought the husband and certain supporters she had.
But then not only the cheesecloth, but Mr. Duncan also disappeared.
He wasn't at the seance. Let's be truthful about it. I think he disappeared because of the questions he was likely to be asked.
And according to Mrs. Duncan's daughter, Gina Brearley, Mr. Duncan was in fact at home with the rest of the family. The organisers of the séance, Mr. and Mrs. Homer, and her agent, Mrs. Frances Brown, were arrested with Mrs. Duncan, and all four were initially charged under the Vagrancy Act. The first hearing of the case took place at Portsmouth Magistrates' Court, where the strange outlines of the story were told against the roar of wartime planes and preparations for D-Day. But by the time the case reached the Old Bailey in London in March, there was a startling new development. To the usual charges of conspiracy to cheat and defraud had been added an obsolete and almost forgotten statute known as the Witchcraft Act of 1735. The accused was now charged with conspiring to pretend to exercise a kind of conjuration that spirits of deceased persons should appear to be present. Arthur West explains the switch to this altogether more ominous-sounding charge.
I did a report for the Director of Public Prosecutions. He was satisfied then we ought to do something. Well, one could have had it out as a false pretense, of course. That was pretty obvious. You could better the Vagrancy Act of 1924, where you practice sorcery and God knows what. But none of this seemed to cover what we were getting at in these circumstances, and therefore the director said, look here, we'll use the old Witchcraft Act. Old it is, he said, but it'll cover what we want, and that's the one we took.
There was an underlying reason for the invoking of the Witchcraft Act, a charge involving very much heavier penalties. Mrs. Duncan, it seemed, was a security risk, a hazard to the national war effort. At her séances, more than once, reference had been made in spiritualist messages to the sinking of British warships, news of which had been kept secret from the general public. HMS Hood and HMS Barham were the ships in question, both sunk in 1940 in enemy broadcasts, though of course there would be no immediate details of individual casualties. But Arthur West thinks Helen Duncan got her facts neither from German radio nor the spirit world.
She obviously got hold of one of the widows of a man, her husband, who had served on the cruiser Barham. This woman got hold of this information from this unfortunate widow, and she broadcast to all the people. There was about 30 people there that night in the little audience seance. And, of course, before you could say knife, it was broadcast throughout Portsmouth.
But if that information was already known by the widow, what risk was there in letting it be known more generally?
Well, I think it's safe to say that these people at that time were told that what they had heard about their husband was absolutely secret. And we had no evidence at all that anyone had transgressed in that direction.
So how seriously did government take this as a risk? Did you have conferences with government in London at this time?
They did not want a lot of song and dance, so to speak, made of the thing, the story of trial. The Admiralty, I do know, a message came to me that they were quite satisfied that was the way to deal with it, without playing too much upon the fact that she got hold of this information.
In other words, they were quite determined that she should be got out of the way.
Oh, they wanted her out of the way, because she was a danger.
Anne Crossley has the same explanation for the official motives against Helen Duncan, but her knowledge of the sinkings, he believes, came directly from her psychic powers.
the Witchcraft Act was a smokescreen, was irrelevant. Through her seances and through the relatives who were communicating, relatives were getting information about their sons going down in ships and dying on the battlefield long before they were getting confirmation from these ministries. Well, when they did finally release the information, it turned out to be precisely the day and the time when the ship had gone down. So she was in possession of the evidence or the information on the same day it happened. Well, of course, they wanted to track Mrs. Duncan down, and they had to find a way of getting her out of circulation. And somebody hit on the Witchcraft Act, and she was tried under that act. But the real truth was that they wanted to out of the way before D-Day.
Whatever the explanation of the seance messages, if she was regarded as a security risk, the authorities had certainly taken their time waiting for the opportunity to prosecute, 3 years to be exact. At any event, the use of the Witchcraft Act now made the case a particularly strong one. Despite the lack of concrete evidence in the shape of the piece of cheesecloth, the very wording of the Act was a powerful factor in the prosecution's favour, as Maurice Barbanel believes.
Under the Witchcraft Act, there was no possible defence, because it all turned on the word pretending to conjure up spirits. And legally, it was maintained that pretending meant that if you said you could produce materializations, you were pretending to do so because it was witchcraft.
So, in the eyes of the spiritualists, then, the Act implied that supernatural powers should not and did not exist, and that anyone claiming to possess them was lying or pretending. Be that as it may, in other ways too, this ancient piece of legislation posed something of a challenge to counsel on both sides. Henry Elam, now a retired judge, was junior prosecuting counsel, with John Maud Casey as his leader. I asked Judge Elam what were his initial reactions on being engaged in the case.
Well, in a way, it sounds blasé to say so. It's just another brief, and I didn't quite realise what it entailed. Possibly I did when I had read my brief and we'd had consultations about it. And, of course, I realised it when I got to the Old Bailey and every seat was packed and the court was packed.
At the outset of the case, what chance of success did you think the prosecution had?
Oh, I thought we should get home, so to speak, if you call it that, because it obviously was a fake in this particular instance. But there's always a chance, in any case, that the accused may be acquitted, and there was certainly a chance in this one that she might have been acquitted, I suppose, because so many people are what I call genuine spiritualists. They genuinely believe it's true.
Oddly enough, there was no mention made at the trial itself of the element of security risk, apart from a brief reference by Chief Constable West at the close of the hearing. Why was the security aspect not made a major feature of the case?
Well, because we didn't quite like to. We were so careful. One, I'm not sure that it's admissible, and two, because there'd been no charge. I think she'd just been warned or something of that sort.
Do you yourself believe now that that is what led to the prosecution, or at least led to the case being brought to London?
Yes, I do, really.
Mm.
It's fair to say that this naval officer did go to the police, but I've got a sort of feeling that there was an underlying current. I can't feel anything else about it.
Even without the security evidence, there were more than enough sensational stories, a fresh set of headlines for every day's newspapers. Queues formed early in the morning in the streets outside the blitz-damaged Old Bailey buildings. Reporters jostled for the inadequate press seats, while learned counsel ploughed through musty volumes dating back to George II's time. The presiding judge was the Recorder of London, Sir Gerald Dodson, and acting for the defence was Mr. C. E. Lowsby, an experienced member of the bar, who was also, it was said, an ardent spiritualist himself. For the whole spiritualist movement, it was a unique rallying point, and at a time when people were living daily with death, the atmosphere in the courtroom was charged with emotion. When all 4 prisoners had pleaded not guilty, John Maud, already a legend at the bar, spelled out clearly the central point of the Witchcraft Act, that no one could be prosecuted for witchcraft, sorcery, or conjuration, but only for pretending to do those things. This case, he stressed, was not aimed at the honest beliefs of any person. It was aimed at common fraud.
At this time, when the dead are no doubt anxiously thought after and anxiously sought after in prayer, such conduct as to pretend to conjure them up, when it is a false and hollow lie, is nothing less than a public mischief. It is impossible not to point out that whatever believers in such matters might say, no doubt it is necessary and convenient or essential that one should do these things in almost pitch darkness, for some reason or another yet unexplained to us mortals. Yet it is also true to say that if you choose to do things in the dark, it is very much easier to do conjuring tricks than it is in the light. What it amounts to is this in our submission. You have what I call the paraphernalia for fraud. The dark room, the little red light. You have the sort of traditional ghost appearing between the curtains. The photographs, very clearly bogus. The ectoplasm, which felt like butter muslin, and seemed to be very strong indeed. One does not want to discourage seekers after truth, but at any rate one has turned the light on to the little room in Portsmouth. And finally, it is not too much to say that the mocking of the dead will cease in the little room over Mr. Homer's shop.
John Maud used all his skills of rhetoric in his long opening speech. Then the Chief Prosecution Witness, Lieutenant Worth, took the stand and told of his growing suspicions of Mrs. Duncan's integrity. At a previous seance, he recalled, a figure had appeared in white, purporting to be his aunt, but all his aunts were living. He was told of a message from a sister born prematurely, but his only sister was also still alive. Other dissatisfied clients followed with similar reports. On the night of the police raid, according to the prosecution, Mrs. Duncan was discovered pushing away a piece of cloth, which was snatched out of the policeman's hands by someone close by. According to the defence, it was ectoplasm that slipped through the policeman's fingers before returning to the body of the medium. Before long, it became apparent that the medium herself, Mrs. Duncan, sitting motionless in the dock in a heavy fur coat, sipping a cup of water from time to time, Mrs. Duncan would not be appearing in the witness box. Instead, her counsel, Mr. Loseby, made a dramatic offer to the judge.
If it be true that Mrs. Duncan is a materialization medium, it means there is a spirit world near her at this moment, possibly waiting for an opportunity to help her, here in the Central Criminal Court. If she be a person through whom spirit forms contact and can under certain circumstances materialize, she might show them here. Why not? She requires but a bare and naked room with a small bare portion curtained off and a red light. That and no more. Members of the jury, I am going to ask you if you think it would help you to ask my lord if you might be allowed to see, and possibly you might hear the voice of her guide for yourselves, and you would be able to judge whether it was her voice or a different voice. It is the acid test to which this woman ought to be willing to subject herself. I only say this: she is so willing.
But the offer of a test seance was declined by his lordship, much to the disappointment of all concerned, including counsel for the prosecution.
Speaking for myself, I was bitterly disappointed in that, because I said to John Maud one day in court, you know what's going to happen, John? She's going to offer to give us an exhibition, and look, if she does, And the judge is bound to ask you if you agree. What if you do say yes, because I want to see it? So it happened exactly like that. But the judge didn't ask us. He said, no, I'm not going to allow this court to be turned into a circus or whatever it was. And so I'm afraid she didn't, so I was disappointed.
Can you tell me why Helen Duncan was not put in the box?
There's always a great argument whether the accused should go in the box or not. I don't think they realise what it means if you don't. Very often people say, I'd rather not go in the witness box, and then you can only point out to them that it looks very bad, speaking slangily, if they don't, but they haven't got to.
Now, a central fact of the case was the disappearing evidence, wasn't it? The sheet.
The evidence about that is, if ectoplasm, whatever it is, I'm not very sure, emerges from some part of your body, the person from whom it emerges must be given a shock of any kind, because it has sometimes rather disastrous effects. It goes back too quickly or something of that sort. Well, now here, when the whistle was blown and the police rushed in and the lights were put up, the white substance, be it ectoplasm or butter muslin, ectoplasm the defence said, butter muslin said the prosecution, didn't go back, shall we say, towards Mrs. Duncan. It went into the ordnance and disappeared. We thought that somebody hid it, because if you buy a large piece of butter muslin, we had their measurements, and damp it, it goes up into the size of a walnut. The police came in, and it's fair to say a lot of women did ask to be searched at the seance then and there, but the police wouldn't do it, and I think in a way they were right. Of course, if they found it, I agree, it was a tremendous point for the prosecution. If they hadn't found it, I agree, it was a tremendous point for the defence.
But medical evidence was against you there, wasn't it, on the regurgitation theory?
They said, yes, the medical evidence and the defence and everybody else, I think, said that she wasn't a regurgitator. I, very humbly, rather thought she was, and a very good one at that. But I'm overruled.
Is that what you still believe today, at the back of your mind, really?
At the back of my mind, yes, I do.
So the cheesecloth, if such it was, could not be found. A strong point against the prosecution, you might think. And the spirits themselves were not to be allowed to demonstrate their presence. However, descriptions of the spirits' appearances at Mrs. Duncan's seances more than made up for these disappointments. A stream of testimony from no less than 45 defence witnesses set up strange vibrations in the dusty courtroom atmosphere.
My friend, Mrs. Allen, came forward. She held her head sideways, just as she did in life. She said, "Give my love to all the family and thank them for the orchids." That was the orchids that her son had put in a wreath at her burial. And I never knew about that until after the seance. She was very near me, almost on top of me, and I had to stand back because the smell was so awful. It was just like death, and it made me feel terrible. I was told it was the ectoplasm smell.
The curtains went on one side, and out there came the living form of my grandfather. He strode across the room, and he put out his hand and grasped mine. He said, "I'm very pleased to see you, Alfred, here in my native city." He had on his smoking cap he used to wear. His face was brown and bronze, just in the same way, the same look in his eye, the same expression in tones I knew so well.
My stepmother came through. I could see her features clearly because she said, "This is what they did to me," and showed me the blood mark where she said, "I was hit in the Blitz." She was killed in the Manchester Blitz. I didn't know that at that time. I knew she'd been killed, but I didn't know about the details of the body. I asked my brother on my next visit to Manchester, and he told me.
Albert came forward and helped the form of my sister forward. I saw the two forms standing together. She'd only been dead a few hours. It wasn't known in the papers. Nobody knew she was dead. Well, nobody expected her to die. She had an operation.
I identified a brother and got close enough again to him to see that he had a moustache. The features were clearly discernible, even to the tan. I find it difficult to say these things because I know what ridicule there is for all these things, and I know how my fellow officers are going to respond to this, but I wanted to have my say.
The guide said there was a lady for me, and I called out, "Is it you, Mother?" And she said, "Yes," and beckoned me to her side. I was standing facing her. She patted my shoulder and said, "My loving daughter." I kissed her. My mother kissed me. She put her arm around my shoulders. My mother had a mole in the hollow of her chin and another over the left eyebrow. And without that, it wouldn't be my mother. And she had it there, and I was satisfied.
After accounts of such intense emotion, there was relief in lighter moments. The court heard, amid considerable laughter, of the manifestation of animal spirits. A cat meowed, and half of it appeared before the curtain. Prosecution witness Lieutenant Worth could not, however, be sure which half. Albert the guide was said to have produced a parrot, claimed by a lady in the audience as her deceased pet Bronco. A star witness for the defence was the famous journalist and spiritualist defender Helen Swaffer. With this flamboyant personality in the witness box in his familiar black cloak, the cross-examination took on an almost theatrical flavour. More than once the judge himself was drawn into the dialogue, perhaps carried away by Swaffer's charisma, as, for example, when Swaffer described a test sitting with Mrs. Duncan.
I took along 4 magicians, 2 professionals and 2 doctors who were amateur magicians. Mrs. Duncan was tied by 40 yards of sash cord. She was handcuffed with police regulation handcuffs, and her 2 thumbs were tied tightly together with 8 yards of thread, so that the thread ate into the flesh. This was done by a professional magician. Even then, the phenomena persisted.
Was that the only manifestation, or were there manifestations of spirits while she was tied up?
There was ectoplasm, my lord.
Did anybody appear in the ectoplasm?
No, you see, the arrival of the ectoplasm itself is a supernormality. My view is that the wildest statements are made in the case of psychic phenomena. I have heard, for instance, that it is ventriloquism. When I have challenged a ventriloquist to throw his voice, he has failed to do it. In the case of Albert, he has a distinct personality. His character, his bearing, his voice, his general approach to anything is utterly different from that of Mrs. Duncan. She is a rather good-natured...
Mr. Swaffer, you are giving us a dissertation.
I'm sorry.
Later in Helen Swaffer's evidence, the topic of the cheesecloth was discussed, and the possibility of regurgitation by Mrs. Duncan. Dampened samples of the material were waved about by counsel in demonstration, as Henry Elam examined for the prosecution. Had Swaffer himself ever made experiments with anyone swallowing the cloth?
I have tried it myself. May I try to swallow that piece you have in your hand?
No, you shall not be bothered with the cheesecloth.
This kind of repartee, with its element of the ridiculous, must have had a strong influence on the jury. Without doubt, another vital weapon in the hands of the prosecution was the admission in open court of Mrs. Duncan's previous conviction for fraud at the Sheriff's Court at Edinburgh in 1933. It was a matter referred to only briefly by the defence counsel in a final summing up that lasted 2¼ hours. Lowsby asked the jury to totally disregard the Edinburgh conviction, and went on to contrast this one occasion with Mrs. Duncan's long record of successful seances.
Bear in mind, members of the jury, if one person, supposed to be dead but not dead, has at any time come through Mrs. Duncan, and I have alleged thousands, one solitary case proves my case. It would be a terrible thing, would it not, if she, being used in this way, were convicted merely because one finds it difficult to understand with precision what was being done. Can you not be sure, at any rate, that the purpose behind it was good? I ask you only to say this, because you have to say no more. In the light of the evidence that has been produced before us, we find it impossible to say that fraud has been proved against this woman beyond all reasonable doubt. That is what you have got to find.
So the trial moved to the judge's summing up at the end of the 7th day. He laid particular emphasis on Mrs. Duncan's non-appearance in the witness box.
Not one syllable in the witness box. 3 hours and 45 minutes by counsel, yes, but you do not decide cases upon speeches of counsel, whether they represent the prosecution or the defense, but upon evidence. 3 of these persons have not chosen to go into the witness box to deal with these charges or to deny anything which is metaphysical or the doctrine of spiritualism, or whether indeed Mrs. Duncan on other occasions can make genuine manifestations. Of course, the defense say if she can on other occasions make genuine manifestations, there would be no need for her ever to make fraudulent ones. But it might be that at certain times such things were necessary because something was not working smoothly, and all these people had paid 12 shillings and sixpence, and something had to be done about it. This might happen. A suggestion was made at one time that a demonstration would assist you. I'm glad to hear from you that you do not think it would. Indeed, it might operate unfairly against this woman, because supposing the spirit, if such a thing there be, was not mindful to come to her assistance on this occasion, then the verdict would have to be against her. Try this case on the evidence, as I have reminded you of it.
After a retirement of just over 20 minutes, they returned a verdict of guilty, not only on Mrs. Duncan, but also on the Homers and Mrs. Brown as her accomplices. In a highly charged atmosphere, the courtroom crowded with spiritualist supporters, the time had come for Recorder Dodson to pass sentence. For Mrs. Duncan's daughter, Gina, it was one that came as no surprise.
About a week after we had been told that she was being held pending investigation, my father and sister and I were sitting in our own home, and we were discussing what would happen. My father very depressed, and he said, I don't understand why investigations, there is no proof of any fraud. Suddenly it was like as if a blind was being quickly let loose and was winding rapidly round the top of the roller, and distinctly I heard a voice saying 9 months.
And 9 months was in fact the sentence delivered by Recorder Dodson. From the dock, Mrs. Duncan cried, I didn't do anything. Then she collapsed, calling out, Oh God, is there a God? Francis Brown received a sentence of 4 months' imprisonment. The Homers were simply bound over to be of good behaviour for 2 years. Was it, looking back, a completely fair trial? Barrister David Whitehouse, who specialises in criminal law and has studied the transcript of the trial, feels that right from the start the prosecution case had the advantage of a brilliant leading counsel in John Maud, KC.
I think John Maud's opening speech to the jury was so fine that no defence counsel could have persuaded a jury there was any doubt about Mrs. Duncan's guilt. He used every technique of the advocate. He moved them near to tears, he made them laugh, and he used ridicule above all.
Do you think that Lowsby had an uphill battle then right from the start against somebody like Maud, or do you think there was something wrong with his handling of the defence in itself?
Well, Lowsby was a fervent believer in spiritualism, and I think that must have affected his handling of the case. He was unable to bring the cold, objective view that a case like this really needed. In his opening speech to the jury, he promised to prove to them that there was another life. What he said was something like this: there is a spirit world knocking at the door of this place. I'm going to prove that there is no such thing as death, that continuity of life can be scientifically proved. If you promise a man sixpence and give him a fiver, he'll be impressed. But Lowsby was promising them a fiver and giving them sixpence.
Supposing I asked you if you'd been handed the case, how differently you would have handled that defence yourself?
Well, one thing I wouldn't have done would have been to have run any risk at all that Mrs. Duncan's previous conviction would have come out in front of the jury. I think that the moment the jury heard she'd been convicted of a similar sort of fraud in Edinburgh, she was sunk. Lowsby only had to persuade one person on that jury that Mrs. Duncan might have produced genuine manifestations for her to be acquitted. And he couldn't do that because Worth, the lieutenant, the main prosecution witness, was obviously absolutely unshaken in cross-examination. One of the prosecution witnesses had held the material. Lots of the defense witnesses gave evidence that the ectoplasm, if it was ectoplasm, would have been going straight back to Mrs. Duncan, and of course it was obviously going in the opposite direction on everybody's account. And it was a case where the defendant's not giving any evidence. There was nobody really to contradict what Worth said about the crucial issues.
Do you think that the digging up of the Witchcraft Act, under which it was an offence to pretend to conjure up spirits, was that impossible to defend, as the spiritualists claimed?
No, that's not true. The word pretend is an ordinary English word, and the jury were told to give it its ordinary English meaning. And if the jury had thought there was any possibility that Mrs. Duncan had truly called up spirits, they couldn't have convicted her. But on the other hand, it really was taking a sledgehammer to crack a nut.
David Whitehouse, with a contemporary lawyer's view on the case. The Helen Duncan story, though, was far from ended. Despite the reassurances of the judge as to the law's impartiality towards spiritualism, Maurice Barbanel saw the verdict as only the beginning of the battle on behalf of the whole spiritualist movement. But first an appeal against conviction was set in motion and rejected.
I was present in the appeal court where poor Nellie Duncan stood at the back, surrounded by women prison officials, sobbing away. And as she was led away after the verdict of the appeal judges, I said to her, "Nellie, keep your chin up. This will lead, in the end, to spiritualists achieving religious and legal freedom." And I tried to make her realize that, although she was the victim, we would ensure and leave no stone unturned that we would get the law altered, and we did. We ran campaigns throughout Britain, public meetings, demanding that as the war was fought for freedom, we had a right to our religious freedom. We had a right to worship in the way that we thought was right. We also had the right to have a legal status and to be accepted as a religious denomination. We had the help of the Home Office draftsman to frame an act of Parliament which would repeal the Witchcraft Act and amend Section 4 of the Vagrancy Act, which applied to mediums, and the House of Commons passed unanimously this private member's bill called the Fraudulent Mediums Act in 1951, in which the only offence can be fraud for monetary gain.
So what difference did this make to practising mediums?
It ensured that they could not be guilty of breaking the law by demonstrating their mediumship, which they were doing in hundreds of spiritualist churches throughout the land and in private sittings. And it ensured that spiritualism was no longer suffering from the taint of being illegal.
And what of Helen Duncan herself? She'd been convicted of pretending to conjure up spirits of the dead, and she served her 9 months in Holloway. What happened to her, though, when she was released?
Well, when she first came home, she was very sad. She was very much embittered by the movement as a whole. She blamed no one particularly, but she was hurt because she had said it could have been conducted better. She was very much distressed that they never ever gave her a chance to prove that she had this gift.
Despite misgivings, Helen Duncan eventually went back to her public demonstrations, and her strange story took its final twist. In November 1956, well after the change in the law, a seance had been arranged to take place at Nottingham, at the home of a friend, although Mrs. Duncan was now a sick woman. The demonstration of materialisation was advertised openly and was well attended. Then, unbelievably, once again, the seance was interrupted by a police raid, and Mrs. Duncan was forcibly removed into another room. She collapsed, and her friends demanded that a doctor be sent for.
He arrived and was taken in to see Mrs. Duncan with an officer, and was told to examine Mrs. Duncan. And he said, "And what am I supposed to be looking for?" He says, "Oh, masks, cheesecloths, what have you, anything that could make up a ghost. This time the doctor had started to examine my mother. Turned and he said, "This woman is in deep shock, do you know?" He said, "While you're examining her, doctor, I want you to check the vagina and the anus, that there is nothing up there." And the doctor said, "Good God, man, do you realize that this woman is dying? And if I start that, she'll die now?" And by that the officer left the room. When she arrived home, we immediately phoned our own doctor. While preparing her for bed, I noticed that on the right breast there was a very bad burn, about the size of a tea plate. On the abdomen there was another burn about the size of a saucer. I drew my father's attention to this, and when the doctor arrived, my father asked him, "What is that?" The doctor said, "It is an electrical burn." My father said, "Could this have been self-induced?" And he said, "No, it is impossible."
What effect did your mother die of?
Because of the blow, as the ectoplasm goes back to the body, and when it goes back, it is an electrical force and it is a blow. It severely damaged the kidneys. So on the death certificate is diabetes and angina.
Helen Duncan died 5 weeks after that Nottingham police raid in December 1956. Looking back at her life, for myself to pressures and manipulations by those around her, the other, the simple Scotswoman, originally gifted with mysterious psychic powers which could illuminate the lives of all who believed in her, and still do. By way of a footnote to the whole strange story, I asked Tom Johansen, chairman of the Spiritualist Association of Great Britain, how he saw this final episode of her life.
There was still this antagonism towards spiritualism and towards physical phenomena. And they were determined, once you've been marked by the police in this case, they are determined to prove it again and again. They searched the cabinet, they searched Helen Duncan, they searched the room, they searched everywhere. They never found a single item that pointed to fraud. I met Helen Duncan once, and I actually did attend one of her meetings, and I am supposed to be sensitive myself. She struck me as being a very honest woman. She was a simple lady, not exactly an educated lady. And it is known that when she was performing these demonstrations, there was every kind of language, every kind of dialect. And she was not a lady who was capable of having that kind of knowledge. But I would say she was one of the most brilliant mediums we had at that time.
The other thing that strikes me is that nothing seems to have been heard of Helen Duncan since her death, which is rather different from what one would expect.
Well, that is true. The same thought has often come into my head. I can only say that she's probably so disillusioned with the treatment she's received on Earth, she wants to blot it out of her memory altogether.
The last witchcraft trial was presented by June Knox-Moore, with contributions from Gina Brearley, Alan Crossley, Maurice Barbarell, Arthur West, Henry Elam, David Whitehouse, and Tom Johansen. The trial scenes and other parts were played by Sheila Mitchell, David Ashford, Frank Duncan, and Edward Kelsey. The last witchcraft trial was produced by Barbara Crowther.